This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air. Welcome to the OI podcast, the Otago Institute podcast, in-depth conversations with experts from the worlds of arts, sciences and mataranga Māori, brought to you by the Otago Institute, the Otago branch of the Royal Society for Arts and Sciences. Today we have a special episode out there because the Royal Society itself, Te Aparangi, has just had the annual Research Honours Awards, and the first tier of these, the first 5 medals awarded, were here in Otipoti, Dunedin, and we were lucky enough to grab a couple of the winners of the medals the day after the awards ceremony and interview them here in the studio. So I've got them live here coming up as they were the day after the ceremony. So this was recorded on the 15th of November. Kia ora, I'm Dr Barb.
And I'm Trudi. I'm here this week, Barbara.
It's true. Hey, today's program is International Relations and Public Diplomacy, and we are privileged to have in the studio a leading voice on international relations, Professor Natalia Chaban.
Thank you.
Did I pronounce that right?
You're absolutely right.
Fantastic. The 2024 recipient of the Mason Durie Medal, awarded by the Royal Society New Zealand, Te Aparangi, for Natalia's innovative research into perceptions in international relations and public diplomacy, most recently focusing on the war in not the Ukraine, but in Ukraine. And interesting, we were just talking before the show, I just wanted to put the Ukraine there. But of course, you're completely right. It's not the New Zealand.
No. It's actually more than just a matter of linguistics. The indicates a province, an area, a region. Sovereign Ukraine since 1991. The new norm is Ukraine. And of course, the old grammatical forms did look in English language the, and that's something which is changing. And with all changes, they take time. And in the area of cognitive linguistics and studies of how we understand the reality, usually takes up to between 25 and 50 years for people to look a new norm. So Ukraine became independent in 1991. So you can count how
33 years. I did the maths before the show.
Exactly. It means that the new norm is locking itself. But yes, it is Ukraine.
It's Ukraine.
Yeah, it's interesting. When we looked at it earlier, I noticed like reporting more recently, they've removed the. So, if we get it in the media, it's a huge step and change.
I guess that's it. It comes into kind of how we talk about it. Once the media, it's usually, sometimes I guess it's people and then the media follows the people. But when it's something that's international to us, I guess it usually follows from the media, and that's kind of an important...
And it also depends on the training of the journalists. If these are the people who were trained sort of in older schools and older universities, they still look the old norm. But things change in the world, and so... Yes, it is Ukraine.
It's nice. I haven't heard that explanation before, but it makes perfect sense. Yeah.
See, not even through the introduction yet, and we're already learning. It's fantastic. So, Professor Natalia, you're at Te Whare Wananga Waitaha, the University of Canterbury. How long have you been there?
I came to University of Canterbury in 2002. And since then, I've been to the university and I'm working there and living in Christchurch. But yes, originally from Ukraine.
Yeah, and did you do all your undergrad and your PhD and everything in Ukraine?
So I did my first degree in Ukraine. It was in Germanic languages.
Right.
But I was always interested in how languages are used to communicate about politics and about international relations. And then I used my knowledge to write my first research, and it was looking into the language used by the US media. So already in the very beginning, I was interested in the intersection of political communication and international relations.
So when you were studying Germanic languages, were you including English in the Germanic?
English is Germanic language. Yes, of course.
We English speakers don't like to be the
no. That's trust me, English is a Germanic language.
Right? I guess that, when we talk about Anglo-Saxons, they were Germanic peoples.
Yeah, it's a linguistic classification of languages, and so English belongs to Western Germanic languages.
Yeah. So what else is in that group there? Just obviously German.
German, yes, it's a different branch. It's a tree of languages. And according to that classification, of course, you have German. And you have in the northern branch, you have Swedish, and you have Norwegian, and you have Danish. So they are all related languages. They're living on the big branch of the so-called Germanic languages. And then there are Latin or Romance languages. And then there are, of course,
so that's
Slavic
the Spanish
languages.
and Italian as well.
That would be in Latin group. There would be French and Romanian and Italian and Portuguese and Spanish.
And Ukraine, where does that fit?
So this is the branch Slavic languages, and then we have sort of the Eastern Slavic languages.
So
that's Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian, and then we have Western Slavic languages that would be Polish and Czech, and Slovak, for example. And then there are Southern Bulgarian, Slovenian, sort of Serbian.
Yeah.
And the outliers are Finnish and Hungarian.
I was just going to ask the same question.
This is very interesting because Finnish and Hungarian, they are non-Indo-European languages. They don't even belong to the Indo-European group of languages in the classification of linguists. And they do sit absolutely separate, and especially if you look at Hungary, how it's surrounded by neighbors speaking Germanic languages, Latin languages, and Slavic languages. And Hungarian language is not related to any of them. It's one of those puzzles, but it is explained how people moved in those older times.
Oh, right.
Around.
So
there were certain...
And I guess there were more of those originally, and some of those original languages may have just gone extinct as languages have come
But
through with the
Hungarian
migrant
actually
people.
is related, you're absolutely right, to Finnish, but also is related to Karel language. Karel people live on the north of the Russian Federation. So it's
on the
north of the Russian Federation.
Oh,
So it was a long time ago when groups were moving. There was one particular tribe of people sort of got split. One went a little bit to the south, and it's Hungary, and others in the north. It's Finnish and Karel language. Wow. So they actually have more common in between each other.
Right. Yeah. And are there people still speaking Karel?
Yeah. Karelia. It's in the Russian Federation. Yes, it's
honestly. Trudy's looking at me like I should have known the answer.
But coming back to your question about my education, I got my master's at New York University, and I got my PhD back in Ukraine, and then I got several postdoc research positions in different universities in the United States and Sweden, and then I got a postdoc fellowship at the University of Canterbury, and I came to New Zealand in 2002 thinking that it'll be a fixed-term contract, for 2 years, and I will go back to the Northern Hemisphere, and in 2024, I'm still here.
Yeah. Oh, well, that's great for us.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
And it's objectively great for us because clearly you are
won an award
at the top of the field because you've just won this amazing award. And how fantastic was it last night to have Prof. Selina Tusitala Marsh, the poet laureate, and actually acting as MC, but also you've got a poem
that was such
dedicated
a surprise.
to you and your research. How fantastic.
In general, the news about the award, it was overwhelming and, humbling. And, it was very exciting, of course. But when I learned that Selina is going to read a poem about my research, first of all, I was intrigued. And second, it was very unusual to get appreciation of your research in a poem. And I think she was fantastic.
It was fantastic, a beautiful touch. And I think it speaks also to the, humanities as a whole area and how it...
I tried to make it as a point in my little speech yesterday that being a researcher is not only about mastering theories and methods. They're very important. That's who you are as a researcher. But that's also about emotion. You have to invest a little bit of your heart into research, but also feel something about your research subject and your results. Without that element, I think it's never a full experience being a researcher. And so the fact that she read the poem was very, very important and very meaningful because poems are always about heart and about emotions. And that's what she, I think, added to that presentation yesterday, that it's about big complex thing, and emotions and heart are part of it.
Exactly. Yeah.
And of course,
can't be one without the other. Yeah.
Us people around who just love language and all the, the intricacies of it and everything. So I think, it's really nice to have people playing with it. And I think, academics in general, but I think scientists, according to the kura that I work with here, sometimes the kids always says, when I tell them what they think a scientist is, they say they're people who make games with words because we're known for our puns, apparently.
Oh, that's a good description. I like it.
So, yeah, but bit of a crazy thing. Yeah, but of course, for yourself, being from Ukraine, it is like right at the heart of you looking in this. And I guess how did you get started along this journey?
So, as I mentioned, I was always interested in the intersection of language, of political discourse, media discourse, and international relations. And I mentioned yesterday in my speech that when I was 15 years old, in the library of my father is a professor of history. He has a big library at home. I found a big, thick book, and that book was about mass communication, and it was a book about how mass communication at times of the Cold War could shape how people imagine the world and how they imagine themselves and others, and how they may use mass communication to shape opinion or manipulate opinion. And when you're 15 and you read something like this, it impresses you, but it didn't just impress me, it fascinated me. And since then, I was always very curious about how other people know about me, how people in other countries know about my country. And I suppose something in my own experience fed into this, because as a teenager, I went through perestroika. I'm sure you've heard about that, right? Mikhail Gorbachev and his reforms of the Soviet Union thing. So that was the beginning of opening.
That's right, because you were a teenager when you were actually in Ukraine before the wall came down. That was your formative years, wasn't it?
So that was exactly the point. So in my formative years, I saw how the walls were falling down, how the European countries became accessible. I was, as a student at the university in my first degree, I went to Germany, and that was after the fall of the wall. And I actually went by bus from Eastern Berlin to Western Berlin, and I didn't think it was unusual. For me, it was normal. But my dad, who is a professor and who'd been to Europe many times, at that point, had never been to Western Berlin, because he was always going there when the Cold War was in full swing. So for me, the bus trip down the Kurfürstendamm was a normal thing rather than an unusual out of this box experience even for my father's generation.
I mean, that must have been really just a couple of years difference though, eh? Because you were growing up as a child going through high school still, imagine. Yeah.
But that was the time when perestroika hit. And so the discourse of the wind of change, right?
The Scorpion song.
Scorpion song, which was
a great podcast. I love it. Yeah.
So that was my formative years. So in my imagination of the world was open. And then I went as a master's student to New York University. That was 1995. My country was independent for 4 years at that point. And there, people were telling me that there are bears walking on my streets. And there are actually no streets. It's all mud. And all women are babushkas. And I was like, I am from that country. We don't have bears. The bears don't live. In the zoo, they live, of course. And we have normal roads. And look at me. I do not look like a babushka. And people was like, no. But I know. I saw the movies. And so that paradox of I am from there. I am in a direct contact with you. I'm telling you how things are. And the people are looking into my face. It's like, no, I know better because I saw a movie. And it's not even a documentary.
It had no even assumption that it was the truth in the movie.
And so for me, then it became, as a researcher, as a curious mind at that time, was just sort of the big research question was, how do people form images? How do they still stick to them, even if they have evidence facing them? And they still continue acting on those stereotypes in images. And so the big question since then, which occupies my research, is about how images and perceptions of others in international relation can help us to map the world, diagnose the situation, form our actions, and build our relationships with others, because you cannot touch images and perceptions. They do not smell, but they're there. They're intangibles, but these intangibles form very tangible outcomes, including wars, invasions, justifying in certain things. And but it's all started from my direct experience of the others who were not willing to change their mind about me, even though I was there in front of them.
That's quite extraordinary. I remember I had a similar, not the same, but a similar conversation when I was in Germany at a wine festival, and they just would not. I went to the little village where ice wine comes from. And there's ice wine here. And I was just, and I was talking to this winemaker. He was just unwilling to believe that New Zealand could produce wine, that there was wine in New Zealand, because New Zealand was a Pacific island where everyone wore grass skirts and it was clearly too hot for there to be wine here. And it was, and as with your experience, he was like, I was saying, like, I'm from there. I'm from Central Otago. There's wine there. I know there's wine there. I'm here to try your wine, but it was just this weird interaction where he just would not believe me.
So did you ask him where did he learn about this? Why?
Yeah. And I think it was part of that Pacific Island idea. Right. Yeah. But
because I actually went ahead and I would ask people, why? Where did you take this information? Yeah. And people would cite lots of popular Hollywood movies at that time, which were produced in great numbers. If you just think about everything from Rocky to there are many masterpieces of that time you can think of. And so Hollywood was cited as a huge reference. And then I was personally interested into, Hollywood is still an imaginary world, but what about the actual media? They give us news. When you read the news, what do you get out of reading the news? And that sort of became my PhD topic. I looked into the US media and how they frame Ukraine. And Ukraine into the first years of its independence, because I got so excited about the fact that people may form their views in somehow different ways. And so what I proposed in my PhD is the sort of a theory and the method of how to study perceptions. And that's why I ended up in New Zealand, because the project I was invited to do was about images and perceptions of the European Union, first in New Zealand and then in the Asia Pacific. Because what as a researcher, you do your case, this is exciting, but then you also have to show that your theory and methods could be applied to other cases. Yeah. And that's what I claimed was my PhD. I said, you can use my theory and method to study what Japan thinks about Georgia, for example. And that's how I studied for many years, and I keep studying images and perceptions of the European Union and at some point NATO in the world. And that's sort of, I do research about Ukraine, but also a big chunk of my research goes into the images and perceptions of the process of European integration.
Yeah, I'm going to come back to the EU, but I just wanted to ask quickly, we're talking about the US media, and from my point of view, I think the US media is quite different in format to the way that media is in New Zealand, because they're very, very strongly right-wing and left-wing, and I think people... Whereas I think that there's some attempt at some point in New Zealand, but possibly because New Zealand's smaller. And I wonder what your take on the US media versus New Zealand media was.
Yeah, probably wouldn't describe them as left and right. They're liberal and conservative. Right. It's more about liberal and conservative.
Right.
This is a little bit of a different... It's sort of, we think it's along the same, but it's a little bit different. US media system is indeed a little bit of a unique media system. Yeah. It belongs in the classification of Harlin and Mantini to the Western liberal type of media system. This is low interference, and New Zealand belongs to the same type. It's low interference by government, independence, but at the same time, a lot is pushed into media survival by media means. So media themselves have to survive and they have to generate profit. And that dictates certain practices because, like, for example, in Germany or in Sweden, government may support more media, and it's a different model.
Right.
So New Zealand and America actually belong in the scientific classification to the same group. And if you think New Zealand media uses lots of American sources in presenting the world, AP is one of the major
I guess we
sources.
have quite an influence from the UK as well with the BBC and also from Australia. A lot of our news begins in Australia. And then, I mean, you tell me where I'm wrong here, but that was just my impression. That
No, you're absolutely right.
And it's possible because I personally have connections to the UK.
The US, the UK, Australia. Well, the language thing, the connections between the people who make news to their colleagues around those countries. Potentially people were educated in those countries or are from those countries. So, there are many different reasons why a media system may prefer certain sources of news. Because of the model in New Zealand news system actually do depend on international news about the world because they're cheaper.
Yeah.
Sending correspondence abroad
sending correspondence is expensive.
It's expensive.
Yeah.
Well, if you look at the United States, the giants like the New York Times or the Washington Post, they have their own correspondence. They send their own correspondence because they have means.
Yeah.
And they also, it's a matter of prestige to send their own correspondence around the world and have bureaus around the world. So they actually generate their own foreign news. While New Zealand has some correspondence, but
very few.
Heavier dependence on international news.
But it's interesting it works the other way too, because during COVID, when I was reading The Guardian, which I don't anymore, they'd pulled an article straight from the New Zealand Herald and dropped it in The Guardian, and it was wrong. I mean, like I thought, wow, there we go. That's some real, they've applied a good
BBC
lens to that. Yeah.
do that, like the BBC, the Guardian, the UK do take news about New Zealand from, I mean, the problem probably lies at the heart is the New Zealand Herald, really, because
they could collaborate. They could collaborate with New Zealand authors on the ground. They could, if there is an agreement between the two outlets, they can reprint the article. It all depends on business arrangements and how it's done. But yes, the Guardian indeed publishes from the place. And of course, New Zealand was such a special case for COVID. In the COVID era, New Zealand actually made a splash because the world noticed how New Zealand fought the pandemic and how New Zealand practiced. Actually, New Zealand taught many other people or countries around the world how to deal with the pandemic.
And it was interesting that it was a very science, research-led response to the pandemic. And I mean, I don't know if you did any actual study on it at the time, but it was very interesting the way that our government of the time, which of course is a different government to what we've got now, actually embraced the media and communication and public communication and disseminating information, and how starkly different that was to, for instance, the US and the UK take.
You're absolutely right. The New Zealand communication campaign around COVID it's actually quite a fascinating case study, and there's interesting research about that. I can definitely recommend about it. But in a nutshell, what was very successful in the New Zealand communication campaign was that the leader of the country at that time, Jacinda Ardern, she is not a scientist. That's why, and the fact that she sort of relinquished the authority to speak about science to Dr. Bloomfield, who is a scientist, demonstrated that government is willing to engage with researchers and scientists and respects their authority. And we, as the public, also respect authority of researchers in a particular area. It also demonstrated that the society has respect to researchers and scientists, which is in the context of our presentation is quite important. Interesting in this context to compare with Germany, where Angela Merkel, the former chancellor, obviously she herself has a PhD in chemistry, and so she was taking two hats. She was wearing two hats at the same time. At some point she was like, I'm speaking like a leader, political leader, and now I'm talking to her like somebody who has PhD in sciences, and I can tell you. So it's an interesting case to compare.
It was interesting because to me it demonstrated how the Westminster political system works. Like Jacinda's the political leader. Dr. Bloomfield was the head of the Ministry of Health. He was responsible. So it's like you have to respect they've got different roles and responsibilities. And so I think it was a really good example of how you can work together blurring those lines, you can have an effective response by people.
But it does come back down to respect, right? Because that was underlying the issues with the US response, is that the president at the time just had no respect at all for the knowledge and the science base and the evidence base. So
in a way, it is about perceptions.
Yeah.
It is about the perception, how we perceive the roles of people was specialized expertise in a particular area. And, so it is about perception.
Because I think the Westminster system sets it up so you can do that, whereas in other jurisdictions, perhaps the lines are more blurred between what the roles are.
I mean, even if the system sets it up at it, if you've got someone in charge of the country who's not prepared to follow the way the system is, then it's nothing's going to save you from that.
No, but if you don't have it, then nothing's going to enable you to operate like that.
Possibly. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm trying very hard not to talk about the current US political system, but of course it is going to have massive repercussions for Ukraine and the Ukraine. Russia. It's funny, I was just thinking, we call it the Ukraine War commonly, but is that what it's referred to in Ukraine?
Well, it's not only in Ukraine, like with other Ukraine language matters. And then if you say war in Ukraine.
Or do you call it the Russian war?
So the names do matter. As we know, Russia calls it special military operation, not even granting it the title of the war. And there are lots of Western discourses often use war in Ukraine, suggesting Ukraine is sort of like a place, location, battlefield, which in fact it's war against Ukraine. It is the Russian-Ukrainian war. It is. It's actually not the war. It's the escalation of the war, because we know the war started in 2014.
Yeah, part two.
One of the invisible wars of Europe until 2022. It started with the annexation of Crimea. Speaking about Crimea, if you say Crimea, you sort of think it could be independent. Well, you say the Crimea, it
sounds weird to say the Crimea, doesn't
but it's a peninsula, the Crimean Peninsula. So if you say the Crimea, then it's a part. So even little, in English language, little the, depending if you're using it or not, may tell a story about you.
Yeah.
So the war has started in 2014. It was obviously going for a long time. So to say just the war meaning 2022 is also not correct. It is escalation of the war. It is a full-scale invasion. So you can see I already mentioned so many so many terms, from conflict and special operation to war and full-scale attack. So language does matter. In Ukraine, yes, it is war against Ukraine, because it is.
In your study, when you're studying the linguistics, are you looking at different countries and how different media in different countries are referring to things? How does your...
So in my research, I don't study linguistics, I study media, and part of my research is study how media in different countries represent through text and image, visual image, different actors. That could be Ukraine. And so language is a very important part of that analysis, but also visual images too. And then we're looking how they relate to each other, text and image. So it's part of the analysis of images and perceptions, but this is not the only. Images and perceptions, they live in the heads. They are not only in media texts or in the pictures selected by the media producers, but they also live in the heads of people. And this is why the most difficult to study images and perceptions, because
you carry them around in your own head.
How do you study what people imagine?
How do you do that? How do you study what people imagine?
The methods then include public opinion surveys, focus groups, interviews, and in this, depending on the subject, you can go deeper with the interviews, where you can reconstruct narratives and you look at all sorts of different mechanisms of how it's done.
You go.
So just talking about linguistics, what's the benefit to Russia to describe it as a special operations?
Special military operation means it de-escalates the status. It's just It's just an operation. Operation could happen. It's something small, insignificant, temporary, not of major profile.
So it's no benefit in terms of internal comms, like if you're calling up troops, they're not, conscripts, they're not having to, awards, perhaps more emotive to mothers sending their sons off to fight than just kind of interested in the
There is terminology of naming the conflicts, and special military operation is something limited, small, will end up soon, doesn't need major resources.
Yeah.
Reality could be different, but we're not talking about reality, we're talking about labels. So if you call it the war, that's a different status. It's quite
that's
big.
the thing,
To me, I was thinking that a war is something that you do against or with someone who's another international partner, like an operation is just within your own boundaries. So it's already kind of Russia, basically claiming that the Ukraine region is just part of Russia still, and that's it. Whereas when you suddenly say it's a war against Russia, you're granting against the Ukraine rather. You're granting Ukraine its own independence. Whereas if you say it's an operation, it's within its own boundaries. It's just an operation, and it kind of. I don't know if this is true, but in my mind, it kind of delegitimizes anyone outside of that zone from having an opinion on it, because this is our internal affairs here. If you're Russia, you're saying, okay, well, actually, it's just an operation within Russia. It's nothing to do with you. Ukraine's part of Russia, and I think
it's an interesting opinion. But Russian Federation used this term military operation against in other external partners. So it does have this undertone about it's not that it's something closer to my borders. It's not that. Yeah. But it's been used in other international contexts. So it is more about that it's sort of very small, limited, don't pay attention to it. It is a message to internal people.
Yeah.
It's sort of you do your stuff, and us professionals, experts, government, military will take care of this operation. Operation is
and I guess it is who the audience of that is, because everyone outside of Russia doesn't call it a special operation.
Well, let's put this way: when on February 24. I saw the news that the Russian troops attacked Ukraine. I immediately, because I speak Russian, of course, I went and checked the Russian media, and there was nothing.
Right.
There was nothing. There was silence. And I just couldn't believe my eyes. While at the moment that the tanks were rolling and the planes and the shooting and everything, the Russian media didn't even say a word. And then it appeared there's something, this military operation going on currently in Ukraine. So the stark contrast between how the beginning of the full-scale invasion was presented in the West, in Ukraine, versus the Russian media was stark. It was puzzling.
So it's like when they say the New Zealand Defence Forces, we're just doing military operations in Tekapo, we might need to pay far more attention, I think.
Do you think
but it's, again, in media studies is well known as a gender setting effect. If it's reported, it must be important. If it's not reported, then it must not be that important.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's a decision that the media, it depends whether the state is having an influence on the media.
It was obvious that in this situation, media was following
this
instructions from above, because you cannot but report about this. This is the beginning of something huge and big, and as we can see, it's already going for the third year. So it was obvious that, as you say, the message was controlled.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. What's the future? Like, if that message is controlled and that's the only place that people in Russia, like the people on the ground, are getting their information from, and I imagine that it's, just for language barriers, a lot of people probably just speak Russian.
Well, Russia is a multicultural country.
Yeah.
There is more than 100 nations and nationalities living there, and they speak different languages. They also have media in their own languages. But in general, in the Russian Federation, at the moment, as we know, the official media, the traditional, the newspapers, the TV, they are being under control.
Yeah.
And those are the sources of information, which is, of course, translating a position of the official establishment and where it goes. But then, of course, we shouldn't forget there is social media space, internet space. Again, this is increasingly controlled in Russia. And but having said that, by using VPNs, citizens of Russian Federation can still overcome those and look for all sorts of information. So internet does provide an opportunity to overcome the limitations installed by the traditional official media, be they television, radio, or newspapers. But we shouldn't forget about entertainment media too. Yeah. Entertainment media in Russia sends very strong political, ideological messages of who is us and who is them. What is Ukraine? We're talking about TV series. We're talking about satirical shows. We're talking about movies, songs.
And of course, things like I was just going to say Eurovision,
pop songs. Yeah,
because there was quite a big thing with Ukraine one year in Russia, and there's a whole political side to the Eurovision.
Russia was not allowed to compete in Eurovision. And so if you think, it's just a popular song contest, actually it was a very strong political statement from the organizers of Eurovision to exclude Russia from the competition. Because Eurovision is very popular, even though it is criticized in Russia. And Russia, of course, says, we didn't even want to be there.
Yeah.
Still, the popularity of the contest was high for decades.
Yeah. So, I mean, even in the UK, it's really high popularity, and they haven't won since, I don't know, Bucks Fizz or something.
So with UK, it's interesting because, as you know, Ukraine won in 2022, and the plan was that in 2023, the competition will take place in Ukraine because that's how it happens with Eurovision.
Yeah.
But it couldn't happen because of safety and security reasons. And so the UK, who came second that year to Ukraine, actually hosted in Liverpool. And if you watch that year broadcast, you know that it was all about Ukraine.
Yeah.
The British whoever organized that show did a very good job in translating message of solidarity with Ukraine, that Europe stands with Ukraine, for Ukraine. They invited a Ukrainian co-presenter, was amazing English. And the symbolism of the Ukrainian flag, it was well done. Ukraine didn't win then, and when the performers who performed in Liverpool were singing, their city was at exactly the same time of performance was bombed. So, but that's
crazy.
Well, this year Ukraine didn't win again, but it was a very strong performance. I don't know if you've seen the performance. Two young women was sort of the backstage showing the missiles flying, and it was very powerful, very powerful. They thought they could win, but they didn't win this. Yeah. But it was a memorable performance.
Yeah, no, interesting, because it is, it's kind of trivialized sometimes. It's a bit of a thing, but and.
Yeah, would that be a really good example of public diplomacy?
Yes, because public diplomacy is the type of diplomacy which serves the soft power projection. So we know that there are hard power means in the world. It's armies, invasion, sanctions. This is hard power. A soft power, it's power of attraction, power of seduction, if you wish. It's a power of admiration. It's actually, why would you fight somebody for them to follow you? Isn't it the better way to collaborate with these people and actually them to like you and admire you and follow you voluntarily just because they like you? So that's the soft power principle. The public diplomacy, it's a state-sponsored activity to promote the image of your country or your international organization like NATO or the European Union or the UN. They all have public diplomacy divisions. The international partners around the world want to admire you, want to deal with you because they like you. And that's what public diplomacy is. So public diplomacy includes, for example, it does include advocacy when embassies, for example, telling we have these exchange programs, we have these film festivals, we have these opportunities to trade. Then it includes cultural diplomacy. I don't need to explain you the term, right?
No, you do.
And cultural diplomacy, it's from film festivals to theater exchanges to exhibitions. It's cultural diplomacy. We have exchange diplomacy, part of public diplomacy, when, for example, students go to different countries or not only students, it could be professionals, exchange diplomacy for business people, exchange diplomacy for
or just
politicians.
postdocs, doing postdocs in different places, and international collaborations, like conferences.
Yes. Like my master's degree was supported by the Muskie program. Muskie was a US senator who believed that it is important to influence the opinion of the post-Soviet elites. So he lobbied for a big fund. So my master's degree at NYU was completely supported by Muskie Fellowship Fund by the U.S. government, and the programs they targeted were education, media, business. These are the specialities who work with people. They become the opinion formers themselves. So it's a very small program, but everything was covered from trip to medical insurance and. Upon return, all the Muskie alumni continued with a very active networking. Within a very short period of time, most of us became quite prominent in many different areas. So this exchange is indeed sponsored by the state, and in this case, it is public diplomacy. But exchanges could happen without state support. 2 schools decided to send kids.
And sister cities, Dunedin has sister city of Edinburgh and sister city in Shanghai, which is really...
That's a so-called grassroots public diplomacy, when people themselves, a community, decide to organize, pool resources and do exchanges. And another part of public diplomacy is the international broadcast. So the international broadcast, if you think Voice of America...
I can remember being in a camping ground in Hungary during the Cold War listening to the Voice of America because it was the only English.
BBC World.
Yeah, English media we could get.
This is the state invests money into political communication exercise, and then the special organization trained broadcast to the world. You may think, isn't it propaganda? Well, public diplomacy is different from propaganda. It may have elements of propaganda, but propaganda is about me imposing my opinion onto you without respecting you and listening back to you. Just take it. Public diplomacy is about dialogue and collaboration. Just take it will not work in public diplomacy. It's about engaging people, talking to people, doing things. So,
And do things... like the All Blacks, do they count as public diplomacy?
Sporting diplomacy.
Sport diplomacy is one of the subtypes of cultural diplomacy.
The Football World Cup and the...
Yeah, absolutely. Because
the Olympics and the Commonwealth Games, I guess they all kind of...
Why would states invest so much money into these are very expensive events. They are to promote the image of the country because... Olympics, the same.
And that's been very, very political over
absolutely.
time.
But it still projects the message of a country as an opportunity for the country to raise profile internationally, show the attractive side of the country, attract massive global... How many countries in the world? A lot. There's a lot of competition for attention. People are overwhelmed with information nowadays. So successful public diplomacy manages to capture the attention of people, and people think like, wow, I really want to go there. I want to travel there. I want to educate my children there. That's a successful public system.
So just going back to Jacinda Ardern, I know when she was the Prime Minister, she went on the Stephen Colbert, the late night show, and she got quite a bit of stick from New Zealand, certain parts of New Zealand for doing that. But surely that is a very good example of public diplomacy.
And of international strategic communication, because she did 3 appearances on Stephen Colbert. I look into this case with my students. I'm actually quite knowledgeable about this case. In terms of the messages, in the first interview, I think she managed to pack lots of messages about New Zealand's trade, New Zealand new routes in New Zealand, flying to Chicago and to Houston. So she informed there are new planes. There is a new trade deal being negotiated with then Trump administration. That was after some things happened on the floor in the UN when Trump was speaking, and there was laughter on the floor.
Oh, that's right.
His
I
words.
remember that, yeah.
And how she dealt with that question very well, very diplomatically, and she projected messages about New Zealand being an egalitarian society that respects women, gives equal opportunity for women with children. That was a masterpiece in international strategic communication. And she used the platform of multi-million show, was international profile, to project New Zealand's image in a very positive way, in a very successful way.
Interesting. And then, of course, she did several shows. She came back to it. So it was obviously the message was in a format that it wasn't seen as propaganda, because you don't ask to be on the Stephen Colbert show. They ask you to come back on because they feel that you're interesting to their audience.
But as I mentioned, part of public diplomacy is advocacy. You need to tell where you're standing, what are your values, what interesting things you have, how others can benefit from dealing with you. You still have to tell the story. And you can tell the story in a propagandistic way, and you can tell the story in an empathetic way. And she told the story in an empathetic way, emphasizing with the audience, with the multi-million TV audience, and with the host. But you know that Stephen Colbert then came to New Zealand. So that sort of, there is a continuation of that, because his broadcast about his trip to New Zealand, again, was very interesting, because it was about New Zealand of certain values and certain opportunities. So well done.
Yeah. And I think just the fact that she picked him up at the airport was so quintessential, quirky New Zealand.
It is very New Zealand.
Something that would just never happen in the US, because, you know, presidents, even ex-presidents have masses of security around them. They don't go anywhere without bulletproof cars and things. And the idea that the Prime Minister would just roll up at the airport and pick up.
Yeah, that was whoever thought about, because of course it's all framed and we know there's a script to this, but whoever thought about this, it's a good find.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, even if it's thought about and framed, still the fact that it's possible.
Exactly.
And that they'll do it.
So it's,
but there were some great finds when the two cars stopped and remember, they rolled down the window, and the driver in the car next is like, "Oh, hello, kia ora," and Stephen thought it was all about him, and it was very good.
You know, I remember when I was a youngster, still at high school, I was working at the Cadrona Hotel, just behind the bar, serving dinner, and not behind the bar. I was too young. I wasn't behind the bar. I was just serving. And Helen Clark was the Prime Minister at the time. Was there at the just in the après ski, and I was just like, "That's Helen Clark." It's just like that's...
Well, as a young postdoc, when I came to New Zealand, I wanted to interview New Zealand elites about their perceptions of the European Union, and I wrote to all leading politicians of New Zealand, in New Zealand Parliament, seats number 1 and seat number 2 of all parties. Yeah. And people replied to me. Yeah. And I actually went to talk to them, which is for me coming from a sort of different background, even in Europe, you cannot do these things so easily. And I actually, I wrote to Helen Clark. She agreed for interview, and then there was a disaster in the Pacific. And she personally wrote to me with apology and saying, "I'm very sorry, I cannot meet with you for interview." For me, it was like, Prime Minister of the country, and I'm, a young researcher. So.
I have a Helen Clark story as well. Okay. She was on the street corner in Oamaru, and my mum says, "Oh, do you know Trudi?" And Helen says, "Everybody knows Trudi." I'm not sure. I have to think about whether that's good or bad.
I'm sure it's a compliment.
Hey, we've only got a couple of minutes left. I can't believe I could just talk to you forever.
We haven't even talked about lots of stuff.
Oh, gosh. Yeah. So I thought I might just throw to you, Natalia, for the last couple of minutes, what you would like to tell us. Where to next for your research? What's happening in the Ukraine? Where are we at? What can people do? Sorry. In Ukraine. I've done it. See, I've been trying so hard all the way through, but it still slips in.
Yep. So I continue with my research into the EU-Ukraine relations and the role of perceptions in EU foreign policy towards Ukraine. One of the new projects at the moment is a big Jean Monnet policy network, where I am one of the partners and I lead work package on strategic communication. And we are studying the heritage diplomacy. So it's another subset of public diplomacy. And it actually looks to the securitization of heritage, when heritage is no longer about the sort of developing contacts between people. It's no longer just something as a vector for peace. But it is becoming a weapon, because the full-scale invasion demonstrated that the heritage could become as an intentional target when your cultural places, your places of worship, your books, your art are destroyed intentionally. And this is to erase identity. It's also erase memory, but it's also to demoralize you.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you've heard maybe I think a week or 2 weeks ago, Russia hit one of the gems of constructivist architecture in Ukraine. It's the first European skyscraper built in 1928, and it is a UNESCO heritage site. And they bombed it, and you could see just the reaction of people on the ground because it's just a building, right? Just bricks, but actually not, because for them it's part of their identities, being of citizens of that city, but also being proud, having UNESCO heritage, their unique construction, and people were very upset. So demoralization is strong, but it's also about. So it's about hybrid warfare, where it's not only heritage sort of buildings and museums, but heritage is also language, it's also memory, it's also history, what we call intangible heritage. And it's contested, it's destroyed, it's appropriated. So it's part of the hybrid warfare. So that's sort of one of my latest projects. I'm working with partners from 15 universities, and in my work package, Strategic Communication, we're looking how Ukraine's historical and cultural heritage, it's year one program, are narrated in the Western and non-Western media. And next year we're going to interview Ukrainian and European Union strategic communicators of Ukraine's cultural and historical heritage. It's one of my projects.
Sounds
I can talk
amazing.
about at least 3 other projects.
We have to have you back on the show.
But
Yeah.
there's no time.
Yeah, no,
I'm
it's
happy
crazy.
to talk about those ones too.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And I guess that, there's some examples of, during wars where countries sort of agree, I don't know if it's up front officially or not, just not to hit each other's churches or places. But then, of course, you get things like, bombing of the whole of the East End of London during the Second World War. That was obviously demoralisation that was aiming for.
Well, as Western allies also bombed some of the German
Oh,
historical
absolutely,
places.
yeah.
And
And Cologne churches,
Yeah.
cathedrals are
What is
classic
sort of
example.
different from, that's what I'm saying, it's not only about bombing the museums, but because of the new media technology, because of different reach to people, it's not just about destroyed museums, but it's also about minds and hearts. And it's also getting into that information space where heritage is a message about who you're from, where you're from, what is your memory, where do you belong to. So that's,
I wonder if that has the potential to galvanise the people even more, though, because I think that whole
It's a risk. It is a risk.
It is a double-edged sword in some ways. Like the bombing of the East End really kind of galvanised the British people, and they turned that into kind of
absolutely
a resistance, and I think that's
that's sort of following on the Kharkiv example. People were very upset about this, but then that's that theme of now we have to fight even more. So it is when people see something destroyed forever, it feeds into even sort of more resistance. Well,
So it does
it's
make
still
you
very
wonder
sad.
why Bomber Command thought it was going to work in the other direction.
But it's one of my latest projects. Do invite me next year or in the year. I can tell you more about the results. And
I'll be
also,
very interested to hear on that. Hey, thank you so much for coming along, and congratulations once again on your very well-deserved award there.
Thank you very much.
No, it's fantastic.
You've been listening to the OI podcast, the shout-out for the arts, sciences and Mataranga Māori.
You can support this podcast by becoming a member of the OI. Check out the Otago Institute for Arts and Sciences on Facebook or our website.
If you'd like to listen again to this episode or others from the series, look for the OI podcast on OAR FM's website, oar.org.nz.
Brought to you by the Otago Institute for Arts and Sciences, the Otago branch of the Royal Society of New Zealand.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air.